All right, you're watching Reality Check. Is India at an inflection point in its fight against the virus and its attempts to turn around the economy? The recent growth numbers for the first quarter of the new financial year, up a quote-unquote record 24%, as well as a late surge in our otherwise faltering vaccination drive, are being seen, especially by those within the government, as evidence of a turnaround. But do the numbers, both the numbers of the economy and the vaccination, hide as much as they reveal? Raghuram Rajan joins me exclusively on NDTV. He is, of course, at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and former head of the Reserve Bank of India. Always a pleasure to have you with us, Professor Rajan. Thank you so much for joining us. Just want to start by asking you about where you see now the overall arc or curve of India's supposed recovery. Do you see any indications that this is real, this is so-called V-shaped recovery, or is this more of a statistical anomaly which really conceals a considerable amount of distress?
Well, I don't think you can rely on the latest numbers to say that there is a strong rebound. And I would use the word rebound before I use the word recovery.
Okay.
I mean, as you know, the 20% growth in the last quarter is from a disastrous 24% plunge in the similar quarter the previous year. In fact, if you look at quarter-on-quarter growth, which is the appropriate metric, we came down rather than went up. So the issue really is we need a rebound. We're seeing that in this quarter. I think some of the numbers post the second wave are showing an uptick. So we are seeing that rebound. Now, the key issue really is this a rebound for the entire economy, or is it a rebound for certain sections of the economy? Certainly on the industrial side, there is a reasonable recovery, but again, this differentiates between the goods that are targeted at richer upper middle class people versus the goods that are targeted at poorer people. Look at, for example, the difference in growth in four-wheeler sales, cars, versus two-wheeler sales. Two-wheeler sales have plunged, while four-wheeler sales, there's only a modest decline. So it is a K-shaped recovery within the economy. But, these are early days yet. I do welcome the good news on the vaccination front. I mean, it does require tremendous effort to start vaccinating 8-9 million people a day. And clearly, this is a tremendous improvement from the disastrous performance we had earlier in the year. So
sure.
Absolutely, we're making progress, but we need more.
Okay, I'll come to vaccination in a second. But on the economy, as you rightly pointed out, there is considerable amount of concern that this may not be a very widespread kind of a rebound or recovery, may not have benefited everybody. But there are certain economic indicators which the government particularly likes to cite to suggest that things have improved not just because of a low base effect, but for example, particularly with GST, goods and services tax collections are up even compared to 2019, which is quote-unquote a normal year, compared to this year or this quarter. Are you seeing any signs at all of a kind of economic uptick, or whatever term one wants to use, which is a sort of a genuine uptick, not a kind of low base uptick?
No, there is a shift. Let's be clear about that. The larger firms, the more formal firms, are experiencing significantly more profit growth relative to the small firms, even amongst the listed firms. So there's a shift in business, in activity to the larger firms. That's one reason why the stock market is doing so well. But it is also a reason that we are seeing more collections, because we're seeing a forced formalization of the economy, if you will. We haven't supported our small and medium businesses to the extent that other countries have. Many of them are in trouble. Many of them are in great difficulty. We just had a session with some small entrepreneurs from Tamil Nadu who are basically saying, we're dead in the water. Please help us. And so what we're seeing is activity migrate from those people to the larger firms. In the longer run, this is, on the one hand, formalization is good. You have higher tax collections, etc. On the other hand, the small and medium enterprises are important for the longer run health of the economy for sustained demand. And if these go out, the question is what is going to replace them. So you don't want formalization by Jhatka. You want formalization by, actually improving the conditions for small and medium businesses to become more formal. I don't think we're seeing that.
That's actually very concerning what you're saying, that the growth we're seeing amongst the bigger businesses, the kind of, the marquee, as it were, companies or sections of the Indian economy might be partly because these smaller businesses, small businesses are getting extinguished. And that's actually migrating to big business.
Well,
Some
I
of
think,
it, at least.
In the longer run,
Yeah.
we need the appropriate scale that is relevant for the economy. But you don't get that appropriate scale by extinguishing the small and medium businesses. You get it by creating an environment where they can grow and they can flourish. And what I worry is some of the effects of the pandemic, as well as the lack of support, is then leading to an extinguishment of these businesses rather than
right. So tell me now about this lack of support. Both, let's talk about businesses and let's talk about individuals. Where do you think we've fallen short? We've rolled out a lot of these schemes which are, in the nature of loans, a whole host of, under these various Atmanirbhar umbrella 1.0, 2.0, etc. Actual cash out has been, as many people have pointed out, very minuscule, to individuals and so on. Where do you think where have we fallen short?
So, let's start with the unemployment numbers, right? We have seen, even before the pandemic, an increase in the unemployment numbers. That was the big talk before the pandemic, but the pandemic has exacerbated that. So the real question is, where do these people who don't have jobs, we're talking about, the formal people who had formal jobs. Of course, there's also an informal sector where people have lost jobs. If they don't have incomes, what do? Well, they go out and try and borrow. And what you can see is a pretty strong ramp up in gold loans. Gold loans are an indicator, not entirely accurate, but certainly something to look at more closely about whether families are in distress. Families part with their gold to borrow only if they can't get money in other ways. You're also seeing, and this is survey data subject to all sorts of criticism, but you're seeing some drop in consumption. There was a historical drop in consumption even before the pandemic, but you're seeing a continuation of that for weaker households. So it is clear that people are suffering. And if you look at concerns, the India Today survey, for example, concerns 83% of people are concerned about unemployment, about getting jobs. So this is a suggestion that all is not good and well in the economy.
Right. So in simple terms, what should the government ought to have been doing more of? Pumping more money direct, like cash, into small businesses, into more cash transfers to those of the lower tiers of the economy.
I think cash transfers, to the extent you can target them reasonably, would be a reasonable approach during this time. Especially, in rural areas we have Narega, which is a form of cash transfer. It is a way of ensuring those households that don't have any support, and you're seeing a tremendous uptake of Narega support. Well, similar proposals have been advocated for urban areas, but we haven't seen any of that happen. And I think that would be something to contemplate as the pandemic endures. Certainly some notion that we're supporting the urban unemployed, because one of the consequences of not supporting them is they go back to their villages. And then when you want to start up again, you have a shortage of labor. And it's very hard to persuade them that, in fact, they will be well supported in the cities. So I think there is a need for some kind of a program of the Narega kind in urban areas to support those who have very little support otherwise.
What do you think is, because so many people have advised either this or variations of this, whether it's you, whether it's Abhijit Banerjee, I mean, the list is endless. What do you think is holding the government back from actually doing more direct spending?
Well, this is where, the point you made earlier makes it even more, even harder to understand. Revenues are up relative to budgeted revenues, right? Because of the formalization, because of the shift in profits to large firms, because they are the ones who are more likely to comply with GST. We have seen direct taxes go up, indirect taxes go up, something like 2 lakh crores at least in additional revenues to the government relative to the budgeted. So that would suggest that, if the government sort of put its mind to it, it could do all this. But I fear that to some extent the government feels it has no room and feels it's better to, maintain that wonderful credit rating that agencies give us. That's important. But sometimes the credit rating agencies themselves are telling us, go spend where it is necessary. That should be our motivation rather than pleasing the financial markets and maybe making a hash of that.
Wow. Okay. So, so you're saying actually in simple terms, the government does have the cash in hand if they want to spend, but they're worried about possibly getting downgraded? And
I am speculating,
right.
So let me be clear. I don't know what the government's sort of concerns are. I would suspect they are worried about fiscal discipline because they've managed to convince the markets to support us. I mean, Indian sort of interest rates for bonds with a lot of support from the RBI are, barely above inflation rates. So in that sense, they have ridden the pandemic well in terms of, the finances.
Right.
The question is, have they ridden it well in terms of the spending, or is there long-term scarring to the economy being done by this? So when you say, am I happy? I think there is a ongoing rebound in the economy. The question is, how sustainable is it?
Okay.
And what are the effects of the scarring going into the medium term?
While we definitely are quite hard on the government in terms of what it's done, or rather what it's not done, and that's how it should be. We always have to hold governments to account. I do want to ask you about the private sector and whether it's leaning in enough as well during this difficult time. Because on the books, private sector, again, the higher tiers, huge profits as you're seeing, reporting. Stock markets, as you mentioned, are on a high. But there's no actual investment. A lot of this is just simply through cost cutting and belt tightening measures, either layoffs, salary cuts and whatnot. That's not very helpful at this time, yes? And oughtn't they to be doing more?
Well, the private sector, follows the incentives they have, right? Certainly, it would be nice if they would invest more. That would add to demand. But if you look at capacity utilization in India, it's around 70%. That is not anywhere near a high level. It's more touching the lower levels that we've seen historically. So if you're not using so much of your capacity, if you've tried to improve productivity and you need less sort of inputs in order to produce that same output, you're not jumping up and down and saying, I'm going to put more investment in the ground. The reality is, if they saw, and you're seeing some with the exports, if they saw a lot of demand, they would come in, there would be a virtuous cycle of more investment. Now, one of the problems, of course, when you have the lower middle class sort of hurting is they spend a lot of their income, but they're not getting that income, which is why scooter demand is so low or two-wheeler demand is so low. So, if you wanted to stimulate the economy at this point, and we are getting close to the point where, with all the success on the, vaccination rollout, we may be able to sustain a process of growth. Then if you wanted to stimulate and provide relief, the best way would be these transfers, these either direct transfers or through some kind of a work scheme to the poor, weaker sections of society. That would be the way you would increase demand.
Right. Okay. So you're saying that if the private sector actually sees that a rise in consumption because consumption has been faltering for a while, then they may be actually incentivized to expand, to produce more, perhaps set up more plants, create more jobs. But someone has to get that going, and you're saying that still very much has to be the government. But as far as the government's own argument that, look, we've created all these incentives, we've provided cheap loans, we've been steadily reducing corporate taxes and so on, private sector is still not stepping up. So there's that on one hand. On the other, when it comes to creating a mahal or an atmosphere to stimulate investment, you also have this constant worry about the sort of statements that come out from the government or those considered close to the regime, which are seen as concerning. And I wanted to just get your views on some of the instances of that which have made headlines recently. And one of which was, of course, I don't know if you saw that attack on Infosys. Complaints that Infosys' GST backbone has not been up to scratch. And there was this attack in this RSS journal which said that Infosys is actually anti-national and is all of that.
So I obviously follow this at a distance, but it just strikes me as completely unproductive. Would you accuse the government of being anti-national for not doing a good job on vaccines initially? You'd say it's a mistake, and people do make mistakes. I don't think the GST rollout has been spectacular. I think it could have been done better, but you don't sort of when people make mistakes, certainly inquire why the mistake was made. We need an inquiry into the vaccine rollout. We need an inquiry into why the GST was not rolled out properly. But learn from those mistakes and don't use it as a club to roll out your own prejudices which exist.
Okay, so as you said, that's not very helpful. The other thing which also has been of concern is that while again there's talk of trying to stimulate private investment and also in fact encourage further foreign investment setting up factories, we've seen now more than one big auto major actually fold up in India. Ford is the latest. What do you see that as just as an isolated thing that's just limited to those companies and the auto sector? Or is there a disconnect between the government saying, listen, we want to encourage more foreign investment, and what actually the conditions are on the ground?
I think it's more the latter. I would say that what we need to do to encourage investment is make the ground more welcoming, which means some of the things the government has been working on, making business more transparent and easier to do. We need far more on that. A lot of it so far has been somewhat cosmetic, but we need to change the ground realities for business, make them feel that it's easier to operate businesses in India. And this is good for our own businesses. Forget foreign businesses. It's good for our own entrepreneurs. But I think beyond that, some of these incentive schemes are to compensate for a very difficult business environment. And, people are not going to take these and feel that it's adequate. To really compensate for a difficult business environment, you need enormous amounts of subsidies. Better to improve the business environment, but also remove the uncertainty about the business environment. You can't keep changing schemes every few months. You can't bring in the foreign investors, then change the rules on them. You need to have some kind of transparency about the process by which rule changes will be made, but also make them as business friendly to the extent that you protect all the relevant interests in our country as well as possible. So I would say work on the frameworks, make them more engaging and interesting, and people will come. Your little bit of subsidy here and there, your incentive schemes, they may help at the margin, but they won't offset deeper problems in the way we produce. And in fact, what you will do is end up just paying people who are going to come here anyway.
Right. I want to ask you though, as we wind down, that whether at all investors and those watching from outside are just only looking at India in terms of the investment opportunities and whether barriers have been lowered or made easier, But are they also looking at what is happening to India as a democracy and the trends that we've seen of late, several of which are concerning? Is that something which they are also looking at? Is that at all a factor when it comes to selecting India as an investment destination, or that doesn't apply when it comes to purely the world of making business decisions?
I think in the world of business and in the world of governments, they're willing to look through some of this in the hope that it doesn't touch their activity. Yes, there are some ethical, governance-oriented businesses that will say, we don't think it's appropriate given this to touch a particular country, but those are few and far between. Many of them don't really care what's happening so long as it doesn't affect them. However, and that is true of governments also. You will find that governments are willing to look through it so long as you cooperate with them in their fight against some bigger enemy. The broader problem is both internal as well as longer term, right? Internal is obviously these kinds of political changes, political moves, these kinds of divisiveness that we see emerging at the national level are problematic for the country itself, and we need to change. It's also creating a more harsher business environment in the longer run, which becomes problematic. The other thing that businesses rarely recognize until too late is when the government operates without checks and balances. That affects them eventually. That the lack of checks and balances implies that arbitrary decisions can be taken with respect to them, and they have very limited recourse because all the tools that would ordinarily check the government are within the grasp of the government. A free press, a uncommitted judiciary, an independent judiciary, all these are in the interest of business. So I think these things play out in the longer run. In the short run, I think business tends to look to its own interest and not recognize the longer term damage that is done.
Right. Very lastly, I want to ask you, because you also been now working with state governments. We've been following some of the conversations you've been having, for example, with the Tamil Nadu finance minister. How do you see that dynamic playing out? Because one of the things that you spoke about these concerns about what is happening to India internally as a democracy has also been this very, very dramatic centralization, and which is turning out to be a real challenge for how we function, as a federal structure. From the vantage of now your conversations with state governments, how much of a worry is that?
I think it's an important worry. I mean, you talked about rising revenues at the central government level, but those aren't being shared with the state governments. Often the state governments are, an effective outlet for infrastructure build. So if you want government activity, you want to engage the state governments. But state government finances are in a pretty bad way, in part because the center has sort of swallowed up a significant fraction of revenues through central cesses, which are not shared with the state government. This is a growing concern. So all this windfall that you talked about in additional central revenues, only a small fraction of it is going to the state governments, and the state governments are really hurting. So, I keep saying this, India is becoming too big to be run exclusively from the center, and that too, not just the center, but the center within the center. And that, taxes the governance capabilities of anyone, including, a very dedicated, it would tax a very dedicated person who worked 24/7. It just is not possible. And I think this kind of over-centralization, in fact, holds us back. Decisions aren't made until very late. Take something simple as appointing CEOs of banks. That takes forever. People are not renewed until, they way past the due date that is supposed to be renewed, or, they're not changed. I mean, appointments, when somebody is leaving. That should be made on time. That's rarely made on time. So, this is suggesting it's a government which is overwhelmed. And so I think the broad decentralization is right, but also effective decentralization within the central government itself is important. Need of the hour. Too many people are looking to that center for guidance, right, and not getting it. And as a result, we get paralysis.
Okay. All right. Important points there, Professor Rajan. Always great to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks very much.
Thank you.